It is June 22nd, 1972, and it's been raining for days. Concerns about the rising Susquehanna River dominate conversations, yet old-timers, remembering the flood of 1936 when waters merely lapped at the basement windows, assured themselves that the dikes now in 72 are higher and stronger than they were in 36. Yet as darkness descended upon us, there was a sense of unease. Residents downstream, unprotected by levees, were urged to prepare for flooding. In the Susquehanna River Valley, such precautions were not unusual. Before daybreak the next morning, conditions took a turn for the worse. The people of Kingston were awakened as police cruisers drove up and down the streets, blaring by loudspeaker that the river would overflow its banks. Kingston was to be evacuated by noon. From a National Guard helicopter hovering over Kirby Park in Kingston, just 10 minutes walk from campus, this view of the Market Street Bridge was taken. That river, which normally flows at a depth of from 4 feet to 12 feet, rose to a depth of 41 feet. Its normal width of about 150 feet stretched from east to west more than 2 miles. This railroad trestle spanning Market Street is a familiar landmark. Here, water rose to 17 feet. This boat, moving north on Wyoming Avenue, has just passed what is now the bakehouse. Ahead, on the left, is the Kingston Corners Building and Sem's Great Hall. Walgreens, today, has replaced the building on the right. As the boat turns left at Kingston Corners, Main Bike World is just ahead of us on the right. Walgreens is immediately behind us. The peaks on the roof of Sprague Hall are visible on the right, and the steeple of the Church of Christ Uniting can be seen over the trees on the left. Eventually, water would reach 12 feet at Kingston Corners and throughout much of the SEM campus. Families living on campus by this time had evacuated. Only Mr. James Kersey, that's Mr. Kersey the elder, and I remain on campus. A few passers-by joined us to wait out the storm in the upper floors of Swetland Hall, but we would soon determine that staying was a bad idea. Watercraft of all sorts, rowboats, canoes, motorboats, and rafts found their way through the streets and alleys of Kingston. This vessel had just emerged from behind Sprague Hall. The Church of Christ Uniting is hidden on the left, and on the right, behind the row of trees, is Sprague Hall and Swetland Hall. One of those who had hoped to wait it out in Swetland Hall was an elderly, blind woman who had walked for blocks. She was exhausted. When the decision was made to vacate the dormitory, this poor, frightened soul sat on these steps just off the first-floor corridor. In her hands, she clutched a small paper bag, undoubtedly her savings and a few family treasures. With water now knee-high inside the building, we guided a boat through the back doors of Swetland Hall, along this corridor, and lifted her from the steps into the boat. One by one, those Swetland refugees drifted away. It was pitch black. There were no street lights. Occasionally, lanterns and flashlights of passing boats broke the darkness. From the air, helicopters hovered with searchlights looking for stranded people below. One guest was left. With water chest high, Kersey waded into the center of back campus, hoping to catch the attention of those roving searchlights. He did. Soon a basket was lowered, and into it we lifted the last Swetland refugee. As she was hoisted into the chopper, it was time for Kersey and Eidam to leave. By boat, we motored across the back campus, over the century-old black fence that had disappeared below the water's surface, then along Maple Avenue by Carpenter Gymnasium. We passed by this building, now Good Shepherd Middle School, and eventually by Nesbitt Field. This traffic light was at eye level as we floated by. We grabbed hold of it by hand to guide the boat around it. Looking back across Nesbitt Field, note the 12-foot fence surrounding the field and tennis courts has disappeared below the water's surface. Here we see the old Arlen's department store, now the Kmart we all know so well, just south of the campus on Wyoming Avenue. When the river crested at 41 feet, this building disappeared from sight. It was completely submerged underwater. From the time the water breached the dikes, it was about 24 hours until it crested. It took the better part of 2 days, however, before the water returned to within its banks. A small group of SEM staff, led by then President Wallace F. Stetler, drove to the campus to find the devastation widespread. Every basement and every first floor of all buildings had been inundated. In Carpenter Dorm, we found water still standing. Water rose above these basement ceilings and onto the first floor, ripping loose the tiles and leaving furnishings askew. Sweatland parlors were turned topsy-turvy. The baby grand piano lifted off the floor, turned upside down, and crashed to the floor. The watermarks on the window curtains reveal how high the water had been in Sweatland Hall. In the Wallace room, looking at the doors that once led into the dining room, several inches of flood mud was left. Here, we've just passed through the front doors of Sprague Hall, and we look down the steps toward the study hall. In 1972, the current study hall actually housed the library, one of the most valued resources of any educational institution. Beginning at 5 in the morning, a garrison of volunteers carried every one of the 12,000 books from the basement to the first floor. There, books were placed carefully in order, hoping that they would be returned in the same order as soon as the threat had passed. In the library, empty shelves toppled and reading tables floated. Is there any wonder that our current library is on the second floor? Nelson Bell Tower, with its 4 clock faces raining over the front campus, was once the entryway to the Nelson Memorial Chapel. The stains on the wooden doors reveal the water's depth on the front campus. The church across the street suffered significant damage too. And as if the flood hadn't caused enough damage, a few weeks later, lightning struck the cupola above Fleck Hall. And then the cleanup began. Desks, dressers, lamps, and bed frames from the first floor of Carpenter Dormitory were removed piece by piece. Mr. Tony Grosick, grandfather of Katrina and Julia Grosick, engineered much of the cleanup and restoration through his construction company. Here he is inside Carpenter Gymnasium, operating a bulldozer to scoop up the buckled and splintered wooden floor. Debris from Carpenter Gym and lobby, floorboards, trophy cases, shelving, furnishings are piled in front of the gym. Remember those library books that were so methodically carried from the basement of Sprague Hall to the first floor? Here they are, saturated and soggy. Water reached even the first floor of Sprague. Describing the loss and devastation to Bishop Howard of the United Methodist Church is SEM President Dr. Stetler. Nearby, the Hoyt Library lost much of its collection as well. For months, this was a familiar sight. Day and night, 24/7, heavy equipment scooped up the ruins and carted it off to the landfill. Left fortunately high and for the most part dry, the Wyoming Seminary lower school grounds became a staging area for the National Guard. Supplies and equipment stored there were then distributed as needed throughout the west side. Even as armies of people removed debris and washed away flood mud, plans to rebuild were being orchestrated. The courage, confidence, and commitment of men like Dr. Wallace Stetler, Mr. Frank Henry, and Mr. Richard Pearsall were critical in guiding SEM into the next phase of its history. Their vision led them not simply to refurbish, it led them to create a new campus. Facilities had to be designed, and funding had to be found. Pictured here is Mr. Frank Carlucci presenting a check from the federal government to President Stettler for disaster relief. Mr. Carlucci, a distinguished SEM alumnus, had been sent to the Wyoming Valley by President Nixon as his personal emissary to direct the flood relief efforts. Construction began on Maple Avenue in 1974 for the first of 4 major construction projects. From left, Trustee Richard Pearsall, Board Chair Frank Henry, Congressman Dan Flood, and President Stettler break ground for what would become the Pettibone-Dixon Student Center, including the Blue Gym, as we know it today. The second building is the current Stettler Learning Resources Center, home of the Kirby Library and admission offices. In the background under construction is the Dan Flood Towers. Picture yourself standing in front of Swetland Hall, looking toward Nelson Clock Tower. In 1972, you would have seen that tower encased in the Nelson Memorial Chapel constructed in 1887. It was in that building that every senior was required to deliver a major speech to the entire student body and faculty. They called them senior orations. Every graduate up to the 1960s remembers their day and that place. Perhaps the most difficult and controversial decision the board had to make in those days was what to do with this grand old building. It had left an indelible impression on countless alumni. Yet a more modern auditorium would enhance theater and music and dance for future generations. The question was raised, would the tower stand alone on its own if the building were carved away from it? It did, and it does. And that compromise preserves an important symbol of seminary's past. It evokes for older alums indelible experiences. Yet as a gathering place in the center of the campus today, it generates new memories, memories as recent as yesterday, and memories yet to come. The chapel building removed and the tower standing on its own, the site was cleared for the Buckingham Performing Arts Center where we sit today. Opened in 1978, it is the third major post-Agnes construction project to be completed. A fourth project, the Faculty Townhouse Complex, was completed in 1977. The flood of 1972 brought on by Hurricane Agnes was a disaster indeed. This 1960s glimpse of Sprague Avenue would never be the same. The old Pettibone-Dixon Gymnasium and Student Center on the left here would be removed, making way for the Stettler Learning Resources Center. The Nelson Memorial Chapel on the right would give way to the Buckingham Performing Arts Center. Sprague Avenue today stands as a tribute to the endurance of this great old school. Even a disaster, the magnitude of what newscasters at the time called the greatest natural disaster in American history, would not discourage the people of Wyoming Seminary from keeping school. From the devastation and destruction of June 23, 1972, the Wyoming Seminary Board of Trustees, faculty, staff, and students rebounded and opened its doors for classes just 1 week late.